Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Councillor James Cole. I'm chairman of the Licensing Committee. I'm being supported by Councillor Phil Barnett, the Vice Chairman. And the other members of the committee in attendance are Councillor Jeff Beck, Graham Bridgman, Billy Drummond, Rick Jones, Tony Linden, David Marsh, Claire Rolls, Martha Vickers. At this point, Paul Anstey, Sean Murphy, Anna Smye and Julia O'Brien are the officers who will be advising the meeting. Moira Fraser is the clerk and Linda Pye is acting as the Zoom host of the meeting. Members, standard Zoom reminders are set out on the slide that should now be being projected. It is. If it becomes necessary for any members to telephone into the meeting, you won't be able to signal to speak. So once everyone has raised a Zoom hand, has spoken, I'll ask anyone who's telephoned in to speak. Voting on items will take place by physically raising your hand. Clerk will confirm the outcome of the vote. Unless the committee asks for the vote to be recorded, the outcome of the vote will not appear in the minutes. So anyone wishing the vote to be recorded must indicate this before the vote's taken. We need to adjourn the meeting at any point. I will adjourn and I'll advise the committee of the revised time and date of the meeting. If it's a short adjournment, you will be able to rejoin this Zoom meeting. Otherwise, a fresh appointment will be sent out. Apologies. We have now had certainly one, if not two, delays. We have no sign of Councillor Abbs. We have an apology from Councillor Williamson, who may be able to turn up in due course. Councillor Drummond is with us, but he is in some pain. He's given me notice that he may have to leave us. My thanks in advance, Billy, for attending anyway. No one has anything to add. I will move on to the minutes. We have minutes of the meeting of the 27th of January 2020. Of those who were present at the time, do you have any comments? Can I have a proposer? Councillor Beck?
I'm happy to
second it.
propose they be adopted as a true record, Chairman.
I'll second it, Chairman.
Thank you very much. In that case, a vote, please, of those who were present by hands. Moira?
Chairman, I can therefore confirm that those minutes are approved.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to the next one, which is the minutes of the meeting on the 14th of May. Could I have a proposer for those? Councillor Barnett and a seconder.
I'll second.
Councillor Linden. Vote please. All in favour?
Chairman, I can confirm that all those present have voted and the minutes have been approved.
Thank you very much. In which case you would like me to sign these, which I will duly do. One signature and another signature. Right, do we have any declarations of interest? Anybody have any declarations of interest?
Chairman, we've not been notified of any in advance of the meeting.
Good, and there's no hands up, so no declarations of interest. In that case, let's move on to item 4, fees and charges. Paul or Sean, which of you is going to introduce this?
I'm happy to, or Sean, do you want me to do it, Sean?
Yeah. If you pick this one up, Paul, as you take me through JPPC. please.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. In essence, this is a process of notification for the licensing committee to consider the proposals that have been previously considered by the Joint Public Protection Committee on the 28th. The purposes around bringing it to licensing committee is obviously there are elements of the fees and charges that get put through public protection which are relevant to licensing policy. And obviously you've had previous conversations that relate to the way that fees and charges impact on the trades. So in terms of the recommendations for tonight, it's a case of agreeing the fees set out that have been noted and that they go forward to full council for the fee setting process. We've also included in there some specifics around the methodologies for particular bits of fees and charges where particular legislation has been considered and the impact of wider legislation in terms of cost recovery, and some of the methodologies that we've had to debate as part of the Joint Public Protection Committee process are included in the appendices to this report. So in summary, what we've tried to do is lay out what it is that's being proposed for next year. And then where the methodologies have gone into a bit more detail, we've looked at the cost recovery process, the costs that the service incur in producing and providing the services that they refer to, and really to make sure that we're as transparent as possible for the consumers, the businesses, the residents on why we charge what we charge to improve the overall sort of relationship between the PPP and the sectors that it applies to. That's it, Chair.
Thank you. Before I open it to other members, I'll take Chairman's privilege to ask you to comment on the phrase, it's not the role of this committee to set the fees for 2021-22.
Yes.
Further on the role of the committee.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. So yes, in principle, the main role of the licensing committee when it comes to fees and charges is to make sure that the role that the PPP carries out, the policies that it implements, are how they want it to be set. How that then applies to fees and charges is around the cost recovery process. And I'll give an example of that. If the licensing committee decide that they want to apply a particular type of policy to a particular trade, it's then the duty of the service to go off and work out what that would cost, that policy would cost to operate. So if, for example, there are particular conditions or particular compliance frameworks that the licensing committee would want the PPP to execute, then the PPP will advise the committee what work's involved, and then there'll be a basic multiplication of the amount of hours per license that activity takes, and ergo that gives you your fee. So whereas traditionally it might have been seen as let's choose what the number's going to be and put that into the fee schedule, the role of the committee is to determine what type of work they want to apply to each trade, and then the service will calculate based on execution of that policy what the fee will be for that given trade. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It does to me. If it doesn't to the others, I'm sure they will question. Thank you for that response. Councillor Bridgman has his hand up, his blue hand.
Indeed, thank you, Chairman. Can I start with a point of order? Could I perhaps ask other members who are currently unmuted to mute themselves, because they're getting a bit of background on it. Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, Paul, a few questions. Firstly, we've discussed previously the relationship between the three authorities within the PPP and getting basically a level playing field across the authorities. So a couple of questions on that. Firstly, on the table that you've got at 1.2, talking about budget allocation, are the 21-22 percentages different to the percentages that went previously? The reason I ask that question is that there seems to be a discrepancy between the percentages and the increases. And if the increases are based on the percentages, I'd expect them to be in line. So I'm just wondering whether there's been a change in proportionality, if I can put it like that, between the three authorities.
There has been a marginal change based on some pension contributions. So it's in terms of the main logic for the way that the PPP budget is distinguished is based on a broad analysis of the demand levels that come in from each of the three local authority areas. And then, if you like, the overheads are then placed on top of that. When that total cost is then worked out, it's then divvied up based on those agreed percentages for the demand workload. What we had to adjust this year was there were some, if you like, technical changes from the finance department in the way that the Berkshire Pension Fund is put together. It doesn't relate specifically to the agreed percentages, but yes, there has been a minor tweak between years on the budgets that each council is paying.
Thanks, that explains that one. And then we discussed previously, and looking at the fee tables previously, there have been some differences between different authorities for different types of fee. Are we moving to a position where there is consistency across the PPP in assuming that each council then sets each licensing committee of each council agrees the proposals you're putting forward, and then each council agrees the fees that the licensing committee has essentially said yay to? I mean, are we getting to consistency?
Everything is improving almost on a committee by committee basis. And when I've presented this paper to other councils, what we've essentially said is that it's a balancing act between staying true to the principles of the PPP, which is wherever possible get consistency, because obviously that improves the overall efficiency of the system if we're doing more things the same. But at the same time, recognising that the will of each individual committee is that they have the ability to influence their own areas' fees. So what we've tried to do on each occasion is explain the methodology that we're applying, and then give the licensing committee or the Joint Public Protection Committee or the wider council in each area the option of understanding that if they want to deviate from the recommended position, that they can do so. They just need to understand what the financial or potential policy implications would be of said deviation. So it's really trying to find the best of both worlds between pointing out what piece of work can be done the same across the three authorities, and then giving the option to deviate from that should they choose, but in full knowledge of implications.
So sticking with that theme, we had a lengthy discussion in January, as minuted, about the private hire operator, effectively the taxi and private hire trade, and what the fees should be for operator licenses, which I see is reflected in the base levels and thus then reflected with a percentage increase for the proposal for 21-22. So have we got consistency now across the patch on operator fees?
Yeah, so I'm looking at Sean just to make sure he's nodding while I'm saying this, but the basic principle here is that because a detailed amount of work was done to improve the transparency on the way that the operators' fees were being calculated, I think it's fair to say that everybody that I'm aware of has agreed with the sentiment of the approach, and that approach has been adopted across the three authorities, and therefore those fees were then translated into the schedule that went to Joint Public Protection Committee and that has been recommended for each of the three authorities to proceed with.
Chair, I can confirm that the methodology is used across the three now for that. If I may just add up, I appear not to have a virtual hand, so I'll put my real one up. Yeah, I mean, we are now very close to uniformity of fees across the three authorities. I think probably the only, Julie may correct me, but the only major one where there's a difference is around street trading, and that is, I think we've got common fees across Wokingham and West Berkshire, but Bracknell have some very specifics to do with their town centre. So they have a two-tier kind of fee system around street trading, I believe. But most of the rest of it has been brought into line basically now, and certainly the private hire operators fees, the methodology is applied across all three authorities.
And on the animal side, the effect is that the fees in West Berkshire then have actually dropped.
Yes. So what we've done. I mean, Paul will explain the methodology on the animal fees, but effectively, what's happened is we've taken the animal fees back to a base fee, which effectively is the administration and the original visit. Basically, and what we're saying is because at the moment the visits primarily contracted, although we do some in-house, that each subsequently visits basically will be paid for on a visit by visit basis. And I guess the methodology of that, what that means is that if you need 2 visits, that's fine, then there's 1 fee. But if because of non-compliances, for example, you end up with 3 or 4 visits, then if we have to keep going back, the more we have to go back, the more you as an individual pay. And what then happens is that burden isn't being shared across the base of all license holders, basically. So effectively, it's that there is a benefit for compliance in the animal fees. There's 2 benefits. One of them is if you've got if you've got high levels of compliance, you get a 3-year license, and then you look at that cost spread over basically the 3 years. And as you say, basically in that setting, then the fees would actually be cheaper than they originally were if you annualised it. But the downside of it is if the business isn't compliant and you have to keep going back, then you have to pay for each subsequent visit. And that's the methodology that's now set out basically in the papers.
And you mentioned the inspections still contracted out in part. We're training our own people.
Yeah. So there was new requirements when the regulations came in 2018. Basically, there was a kind of handover period, but effectively there were new competence requirements for people carrying out inspections. And Julia, I mean, you can probably confirm it, but I believe we've got 2 people who are going through the process of doing that course to carry out those inspections in due course.
Yes, that's correct, Sean. The 2 officers started their preliminary qualifications just September time. So hopefully about the shortest is 12 months, but realistically near 18 months before they'd be qualified to do the inspections.
Okay, well, it's on the way. Councillor Brick, can I move on to the next questioner?
Well, I was going to raise the animal welfare point because I do think that we know that this is an important issue. It's received an amount of media coverage, and therefore I did want to ensure that I know we have got detailed information in the agenda pack, which is of course available to the public online, but I did want to give officers an opportunity to comment on how the conversation has gone, if you like, how it's not a negotiation, how the consultation has gone, and where we have arrived at, because I do think it's important that the public understands and operators understand that where we have moved to is if you are good, if you comply, if you do all the right things, you will effectively pay less by being better at it.
Yeah. We had a conversation at the PPP not so long ago. Sean, would you like to comment for the purposes of this meeting?
This is very definitely Paul's. Paul has done a lot of discussions with the trade, haven't you, Paul? And obviously we had the letters that were presented basically to the Joint Public Protection Committee at the time, which have fed through basically to the methodology here. So if I may, Chair, Paul, if you could talk through the discussions you've had.
Yeah, so yes, it's absolutely correct. We were in receipt of 3 public questions that went to the Joint Public Protection Committee. So it is all a matter of public record now, the questions and the answers that were given. The principles around this were that the trade and I think it's worth on a kind of general point to start with, that obviously since this last licensing committee, the world is considerably different, and there are a lot of the licensed trade across all different sectors that have been impacted significantly, and the service has been through an awful lot of dialogue with a lot of people and a lot of businesses around making sure that we can be as supportive as possible, whether that's through deferring payments, scheduling payments, making sure that if we are not able to carry out the work, because obviously as a service we've been heavily impacted and involved in the PPP response, we've done everything we can to try and make sure that the businesses are well supported. Now, in saying that, inevitably, there are some within these different trades that are what I would class as micro businesses. So, one person working out of their home, carrying out traded activity. Now, the conversations that I've had with those particular individuals has all been based around an understanding of transparency and making sure that they understand the costs, the genuine costs that are incurred by a local authority in producing not just a piece of paper that's got some licensing conditions on it, but a range of activities and the compliance framework that needs to sit around that. Because our objectives as a licensing authority are more than just issuing bits of paper. It's about making sure that there's a level playing field, and we need to make sure that there are not people out there who are making money out of business practices without a license. So there are a range of objectives that we have to meet. That means that cost recovery takes us beyond what some people consider to be reasonable. So a lot of our discussion has been about educating and explaining what that cost recovery process includes and what the law and the associated guidance allows us to charge for. And the new fees that we're now considering are what I would consider to be a very solid template for us to discuss with the trade and explain to them in a very open way what costs would be incurred for them being involved in that type of business. And certainly the feedback that I've had is, even if they may not necessarily disagree, they may not necessarily agree with the final number that we've come to for a variety of different reasons, they all feel that they've been listened to and that we've come up with a methodology that they can all read and understand, and that they realise what the implications are of carrying on in said business. So for me, the paperwork that's been done, the consultation that's taken place is a template that we can use for other sectors into the future. But again, I'll say something that I've said to all of the committees, which is we do know that there are other fees and charges within our schedule that require the same level of attention. But to give you an understanding of that, the work that goes into establishing that level of transparency is not insignificant. And in times of unprecedented demand, it is not possible for us to carry out the review in that level of detail for every single fee and charge. So there are fees and charges that will need to be reviewed in the future. And that's something that we're talking about as a service, as a shared service across the partnership to resolve some of that. But I think that where the matters have been brought to our attention, we've responded to it in a reasonable way, and I'd like to think that the trade would accept and acknowledge the effort that's gone into dealing with those concerns, particularly in current circumstances.
Thank you, Chairman.
Has been done. We do have transparency.
Correct.
That can only be good. Councillor Bridgman.
Thank you.
Long. Your hand is still up. We'll assume it's moving down. Councillor.
It is being removed as you speak, Chairman.
Councillor Barnett.
Chairman, members, officers. I mean, some of the points that I was going to raise have been partially answered. Obviously, I welcome a rounding up on fees. I think it's only for the good of everybody concerned to be seen to be working across the different authorities in a consistent way. The little concern I've got is looking at some of the figures. We might be moving into other territory at the moment, but looking at some of the figures in regarding numbers of establishments visited and obviously projected, and then also looking at the present circumstances, it's quite clear that numbers are going to drop, and obviously revenue is going to drop to a certain extent. The point I was going to move on was the point that I think Sean Murphy made was regarding training in-house officers, and presumably projecting on sort of overall numbers and requirements. There's very likelihood that the need for external support is going to be minimum, if practically non-existent in future, if the in-house officers are fully trained. Am I correct in my assumption? Probably the questions to Paul on that. That's the first point. And obviously the other point is that we are in a position at the moment where, and I think it's touched on, that there is a lot of individuals possibly not registered or probably not working to what they should be in relationship to looking after animals, in especially looking at the dog walking operation. Are they technically officially operating with a certain number of dogs, and also especially in public places, and also insurance and things like that? You mentioned obviously inspections, but my belief is that there is unofficial dog walking operations taking place, and I have a little bit of worry in relationship to where they might be walking and how they're looking after the dogs, especially when there's children involved.
Okay. Yep. Thank you, Chairman. So first answer is we are training up our own staff, because obviously it's almost it's a given that we as a regulating authority need to make sure that we understand the different issues relating to, sorry, bear with me 1 second. No, go. There you go. It had to happen at some point. I've been interrupted by a child. Not
a dog.
No, not a dog this time. The issue for me is that the commitment that we gave to the trade was that if there were charges that needed to be levelled at a given operator, that we would make sure that we provided them with the best and, if you like, cheapest option. Now, as it stands, that the contractors that we operate with provide us with a very cost-effective service, so we are passing that cost directly onto the trade. Now, if at some point in the future, based on our cost recovery model, we believe that we can offer that service for less than we're paying through the contract, then it will switch to the officers providing that service directly. The thing that we've made very clear, and I would hope that everyone would accept this position, which is we don't want to insist on our own staff doing the work if it means that we pass on a greater cost to the business. So what we've got in our balancing act is having a clear aspiration that our own officers are fully appraised of how to do the job and that they are competent in doing the job, but at the same time not passing on unnecessary costs if a contractor can do it for us cheaper, because that by definition passes that saving on to the trade. So that's the principle that we've worked to in all of our conversations. And to be honest, that would apply to any type of license. If we can find a way of doing it that means that we can reduce the cost and it doesn't impact on our overall ability to deliver a licensing service, then that should be the model that we work to. And then in relation to your second point, Councillor Barnett, I think what we would say is that we've identified a trend, unsurprisingly in current circumstances, of decline across a variety of sectors, which we are monitoring very closely, because like any business, if our income starts drying up, we need to adapt. So all of our operations need to be set up on an assumption of a certain level of trade. If that trade declines, we need to review our operations. There's no guarantees at the moment about how long or if there will be recovery in any given sectors, but the principles of what we've talked about in terms of cost recovery is that we will have to adjust each year what it costs us to provide those services. So again, not making any predictions sitting here today, but it goes without saying that if we have a fundamental change in our income position next year, Sean and the team will have to sit down and work out how they operate a business without losing lots of money for the council. That's just how we have to operate, because we are a service that relies on a significant amount of income. I'm trying to remember what your last question was.
What it was, Paul, it was this unofficial operation, which I think a lot of residents are a little bit concerned about the numbers of dogs that are walked and where they're walked and how they're looked after during the walking exercise. Yeah. So again, Julia or Sean might want to come in terms of some of the specifics, but again, in terms of what we've discussed as three authorities across the Joint Management Board, has been this issue of if we are monitoring for compliance against whatever legislation it is, and we find that there is a level of enforcement that is required, then we have to look at whether or not the individual legislation allows us to charge for compliance. So one of the things you need to bear in mind is that
we cannot apply a general rule to all licensing activities, because some licenses and the fees do not allow us to charge for enforcement action, because in the eyes of some pieces of legislation, the cost of enforcement is recovered when you fine and get costs through the courts. Whereas some pieces of legislation, to be honest, the more modern ones, they've reviewed and essentially predicted that there would be enforcement and compliance costs, and specifically written into the legislation, and this is what's happened with the homeboarding, is that homeboarding, when you are looking for people who are unlicensed, you can charge for that activity across the entire license base. So to give you an example, there are at the time of writing the report, there were 113 licensed homeboarders, and there may well have been any number of unlicensed people charging for that type of business. And we had to look at our evidence base to determine what was a reasonable level to charge those 113 businesses in order to protect essentially their industry. Now, one of the things that was exercising the trade at that point was they couldn't understand why they should have to pay for the enforcement of those other people. So what we agreed was we would monitor levels of complaint for potential unlicensed traders. And if we had any intel that came through on social media platforms, complainants, whatever it happened to be, and then in a year's time, we would determine whether or not there was a significant amount of enforcement action required, and then spread that cost out across the trade. And that was considered to be the fairest and most transparent way of doing it. I hope that explains and answers the question.
Chair, can I just add on that, if I may? I've still got no virtual hand. That we obviously we also follow up allegations of unlicensed trading. For example, dog breeders we're looking at, and actually areas where we may feel that there may be an issue that people aren't licensed that should be licensed, and we have a plan basically going forward to look at some of those areas. So I think it's very important. I mean, ultimately, if you look at the animal stuff, you've got to get back to where the whole thing starts, which is about high levels of animal welfare. That's what the whole aim of the law is. So basically, we want a regime that works for the people that are licensed within the regime and builds that confidence, basically, that from effectively users of the service, in the case of home boarders, that basically the thing is properly regulated, that standards are high. But also, basically, we want to make sure that there is no welfare detriment that results basically from unlicensed people within the marketplace, whether that's boarders or whether that basically is, animal breeders. So we do basically, we will deal with any referrals that come through to us. We will investigate allegations that come through. And we have got plans to look at certain parts of the sector basically going forward to make sure that there aren't people operating within the sector that are unlicensed. Thank you.
Councillor Rolls.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask Paul a question? It follows on from a couple of comments you made about the impact of COVID and the current environment that we're in, which runs through the report quite a lot. I just wondered, and sorry if I've missed this, if any of the government funding that's sort of come down the tracks to West Berkshire has filtered its way through to this, even on a short-term basis, for the benefit of businesses and, trade certain specific areas, or if that is not relevant, because I appreciate some of the government funding will be ring-fenced and probably quite strict rules and regulations around how we can allocate that. It was just a observation straight question.
Yep, no, it's a fair point. I think what I would say is that in general terms, there isn't a specific fund that's been identified for licensing. What has tended to be the case is it's fallen into kind of two, as far as local authorities are concerned, it's kind of fallen into two pots. You've got pots to support businesses, so how businesses access support funds directly from the government. And then you've got the local government pot, which is where we can identify lost income based on whatever activities we're undertaking. So what I would say is that, and Sean will probably add some more into this because we've had quite a lot of work engaging with businesses of all types about advising them on the impacts of COVID and how they can best protect themselves and best prepare themselves, etc. But what I would say is that, as far as I'm aware, there aren't any specific licensing-based grants, but that lots of businesses that are licensed have been able to access either one of those two pots.
Chair, can I also just add, and maybe bring Julia in here as well? We probably have never had a greater dialogue with licence holders from across all sorts of sectors. I mean, Julia, could you? I mean, maybe you could just give a couple of the examples of things that we've tried to do to assist the trade, particularly around things like suspension or pausing of licences and things like that.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Certainly for a lot of the taxi trade, we've allowed them to suspend their licences, their vehicle licences or badge licences or operator licences, in order they don't need to, for example, have the upkeep of their vehicles, need to do the 6 monthly checks on maintenance and that kind of things if they're using them as a vehicle for applying for hire. Some of the other things we've done, Sean has actually just done a webinar this afternoon, is inviting, particularly this time, the hospitality businesses over all three authorities to a sort of a question and answer session of, these are the latest regulations. If people have got questions on how they're going to operate. And the other thing we're doing is to allow people to pay for things like street trading consents over months rather than initially up front. So those are the kind of things. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, we've certainly dealt with hundreds of service requests across the authorities from licence holders over this period, and to try and provide advice, to try and do what we can, to provide support to the sector, and certainly around law changes, advisory visits, anything we can really within the scope of what we're able to do. But it's, we recognise it's a very, very difficult time. We recognise that.
Certainly is. Right, Councillor Jones.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question. Clearly, you've as you said, had a lot of conversations with various licence holders in various trades, and at least two areas that you show in the list of fees have obviously been through several iterations in terms of arriving at the figures that you arrived at and the methodologies. With all that work, I hope the answer to the question is no, but do you expect from any of the trades, hospitality, gambling, animal welfare, taxi, private hire or whatever, any pushback from what you're now proposing?
Well, I mean, if I may, Chair.
Please.
Yeah, what I would suggest is that different trades are going to respond to this in quite different ways, would be my sort of gut feel on that, to be honest. Where we've got some intel around how the recovery, the kind of nationwide recovery process and where the different sectors are going to be impacted, it's going to track very closely to different types of, the law of unintended consequences, as and when lockdown calms, as and when the tier system kicks in and has been in play for a longer period of time. I think what you'll start to see is that certain elements of the trade will recover at different speeds. And certainly my overall take has been, when we've engaged with the businesses, the level of direct, if you like, confrontation and argument is when they do not understand why they are being charged what they are being charged. I think in the vast majority of cases I've been involved with personally, once you sit down and go through at a level of detail what it is that we're asking to charge for and why, they do understand and go away, pay the bill, and it's fine. I think the bit where I would say, if I was looking forward at where there might be some future debate, as I alluded to earlier, there are some fees and charges still in our system where perhaps the direct links between transparent information and the fee that we charge still exists. If there's some ambiguity around that, I can see that being something that gets poured over in a bit more scrutiny. Every time, from my experience over the last, probably over 5 years, as and when the debate about why local authorities charge what they charge, how they're allowed to charge, and that transparency agenda has crept up through the consciousness of different trades. That conversation is broadening. So I would think that you overlay what's going on with COVID, if you like, the damage that's been done to the various trades, their understanding and awareness about the ability to challenge on fees and charges. I think all of those things will play out, and over the course of probably the next year or two, I would expect there to be a number of debates about different areas, different sectors. But I think for the ones that we've reviewed, I think that we can sort of hold our heads up high that we've done right by them, and that they understand why they're being charged that.
Good.
Thank you, Paul. Very good.
In that case, if we have no further, Councillor Bridgman has his hand up again.
Yes, apologies, Chairman. What I wanted to just add on to what Paul's just said is I think that was borne out by the discussions we had with the taxi trade over those fees in January. Now, clearly, that was a pre-COVID conversation, and one wouldn't wish to lay that on just as a generality at the current time. But going forward, that whole conversation where we identified that you have an incremental based on the workload. So in this case, it was a quarter of an hour per vehicle per year. As long as you get that logic into the fee structure, as opposed to this sort of whole lumping bands together and having lumpy fees, if I can put it like that, I think you get the right conversation with the trade, and they understand where you're coming from, and you can have a logic to your fee structure. So the more I think we go forward with that concept behind our fee structure, where you have multiple things, be it vehicles or animals or establishments or whatever, within a fee, the better it is for everyone. It's better for the local authority because it makes it more logical and more easily explained, and and I think it's better for the trade because they can see where you're coming from.
And back in January, we intended to talk again to the trade, and of course that has temporarily gone by the board. But we will need.
Well, certainly, Chairman. I was going to mention, not as part of this because it's not to do with these fees and these charges, but we still need to, at some point, bring back the conversation about cab fares as opposed to fees for operating. But that's in the minutes somewhere in the dim and distant and it just needs to be on a sort of an action plan for this committee. But that's going forward.
Chair, I was going to suggest on that point that at some point we do need to have that conversation going forward with the trade again. What we do know, I think, Julia, from the other areas is that, in fact, both of them had proposed basically fare increases, hadn't they, to their relevant licensing committees. And obviously, with the impact of COVID, it decided against it. Yes. Obviously, from that point of view, but I do think we need to return to that issue, as Councillor Bridgman has said, and have that conversation going forward in the next, the coming period. It's just knowing what this is going to look like, basically in a few months, as none of us do. But the conversation, I guess, the dialogue needs to continue.
But it's something to look at in January, realistically. Anybody else, anything else to add? If not, we are going to need a vote on this. I'm going to read out the recommendation, and I'm going to be looking for a proposer and seconder on this. Recommendation is that the committee considers the report, note the proposals, and agrees these fees set out in Appendix C go forward for consideration as part of the council fee setting process. The committee recommends that the fees for taxi and private hire vehicles and private hire operators are put forward for statutory consultation. The committee recommends that the methodology at Appendix B for calculating fees for home animal boarding establishments licensed under Animal Welfare, Licensing of Activities Involving Animals, England, Regulations 2018, should be applied to 2021. May I have a proposer, please?
Proposed, Chairman.
Seconder? I'll
Second-
choose Councillor
second.
Barnett. I think he would like to second it.
Absolutely, Chairman.
And in that case, a vote, please. Hands will do. Moira?
I mean, that appears that everybody's in favour of the recommendations as set out in the report. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. In that case, let's move on. Licensing annual report. Anna or Julia, one of you is introducing this.
Thank you, Chair. I'll introduce this one, and probably if there's any questions, Julia and I between us will be able to answer them. Just to introduce myself, because I think a couple of the members here might not have seen my face, certainly on a licensing committee before. I'm one of the strategic managers within the Public Protection Partnership, and have been working with Julia and Sean on some of the performance information, especially around licensing. So the report here is to set out the work of the licensing committee in 2019-2020, and as well as work of the licensing service that's delivered through the Public Protection Partnership. A lot of the data, as we've already discussed, is perhaps in a different place now with COVID. So just be mindful of that in terms of where we were in the last year. The recommendation is that the committee notes the content of the report and the activity that's taken place by the service. Just to go down, there are no decisions to be made, but I have put some information and commentary in the equalities impact, because I think it's important to recognise that some of the decisions that have been made by the committee may have had sort of positive impacts, such as those around the taxi trade, the environmental impact, and the work and recommendations that were made by the committee, I think in September last year, around vehicle emissions. The summary really focuses on the figures that are in Appendix A and B for members. We've heard about inspections that have been carried out. Officers have been carrying those out. There were 168 inspections by those officers, an additional 40 by contractors, so they would be the City of London and perhaps vets and other authorities we might have brought in to carry out inspections. It also covers some of the work of the subcommittees. We've had a number of cases, hearings that have been held on premises, whether they've been called for reviews or where objections have been made to applications. And we've already heard about some of the improved communications with the trade, and I think the seeds were sown for that last year with improvements to the Public Protection Partnership website and our ability to communicate much more through social media channels. And we were really getting to grips with that at the beginning of the year, so that's come in very handy. We were able to get messages out in March before the lockdown happened and share information. We have also been able to receive complaints through that route now as well. So members of the public can record complaints about service or complaining about other members of the trade through that route. And so in page, I think it's page 64, where it's got an additional breakdown, because I think we tend to call it service requests, whereas very much it's a mix of the trade asking for advice and information from us, as well as people wanting to report and complain about businesses such as, premises going, opening too late, or drivers' abusive behaviour, things like that. So I've tried to break that down a bit clearer for you as to how those complaints are made up. Just to continue there, really, it's a summary of the figures. The volume of work and licenses that are held, as I said, they're at year end for March. The figure are probably quite different now, but I think it's just useful summary for the committee to see the work and also reflect the some of the policy decisions and some of the hearing results that have been made by this committee. You're on mute.
I need to unmute myself. Try to avoid the noise of dogfights in the background. The PPP's ability to communicate has changed remarkably. That I will compliment you on. Excellent change. Councillor Bridgman, you have your hand up.
Yeah, and I'd certainly second that. I think the communications that have come out of the PPP have been excellent and very informative, and I've shared them with my community and seem to have gone down well. My question is about the tables in Appendix A, because I'm not quite understanding. I just want to make sure that I understand what I'm being told, because we have two, I think, tables, or well, more than two, but the two I'm looking at are the first two. One to show active licenses, and the other to show, I guess, workload, to the number of applications received. And therefore, on the first one, on the table of active licenses, there's a reference to personal licenses, so that there's been an increase there, I think, of 80 from the previous year. So we've got what, over 2,000 people with West Berkshire. This is West Berkshire, so West Berkshire personal licenses. And then a couple of iterations down, we've got premises license, open bracket, in no alcohol. And below that, premises license application, bracket, no alcohol. So I thought that applications were in the other table, not here. So I just want to understand what I'm being told on those two rows, the two premises license rows.
Shall I answer that, Chair? I apologise. I did mean to point that out in the report. So it should actually say Inc. So including alcohol on the first one. It's just a typing error. It should just be the premises licence that are held that just don't have alcohol included in them. So it shouldn't have the word application in there.
So the first one is alcohol license, premises licenses that have alcohol on sale, off sale. And the second one is a premises license that doesn't have alcohol.
Yeah, Julia, I don't know if there's any particular reason we separated that out in this year's, but I don't think we've done that before. But on this year we were able to do that, so we've included it.
And that would therefore mean if the non-alcohol ones were included in the total for the year to 2019, it means that there's been an increase of, I don't know what, about 30 or 40 premises licenses across the piece.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Marsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a couple of very general questions about the work of the committee. They're not specifically related to this report, but I'm just wondering, would you allow me to raise them at this point? It seems an appropriate point. Is that acceptable?
If they are close enough to...
I think they're close enough. Well,
give it a try.
Well, the report does refer to the various as subcommittee that have taken place, and I'm just wondering about that, about the small groups that hear individual licenses. Are we legally obliged to have those restricted to the small number of members that we have now, the 3 people that
Yes, we certainly are. I can answer that one.
Okay.
We tried, indeed, Councillor Bridgman was instrumental in trying to change it so that we could have the substitute, the 4th, as part of the committee. And we actually lost something, had to repeat. It went to appeal, didn't it? Because we didn't follow the law.
Chair, yes, I mean, the law is absolutely clear with the Licensing Act that effectively it has to be 3 members of the full committee, not 2, not 4, it has to be 3. And there is no...
aware of that. I'm slightly surprised. Is there no facility? I mean, I thought that the casino application that was recently considered was a pretty big controversial issue, and that would enable the entire committee to meet to consider it. Because it just occurs to me, I'm not making any, casting any aspersions about the 3 people who heard the hearing, of course, but this committee has had no chance to come to a decision about that. 3 people came to the decision. And even if we now all thought this is a terrible decision and that there were good licensing grounds to refuse it, there's nothing we can do. So what if, I don't know, somebody wanted to change the Kennett Centre into a massive sex emporium or something? Is there no way that we can do anything other than have a small committee of 3 people to consider these very important matters that might occasionally?
John?
Well,
I need to go away, Julia. I need to go away and look at the Gambling Act, which is obviously a separate setting, but it's very much based on the principles of the Licensing Act. Julia, can you confirm the subcommittee position on the Gambling Act?
I need to look at it a bit further with our legal colleagues, but certainly what currently now the subcommittee is in our constitution.
Yeah.
But we do need to check the legislation. The Gambling Act legislation may be slightly different because it does differ to the Licensing Act, but certainly Sean's right. The Licensing Act is a requirement that there are 3 members of a subcommittee to make decisions.
There are 2 elements to this. So obviously there is the statutory provisions. For example, the Licensing Act 2003 says the committee shall be between X number and Y number members, and effectively the subcommittee shall be 3 members who have had adequate or suitable training, in effect. So that's one of the legal requirements. And then there are separate regulations that sit around the processes of how hearings are conducted. Added to that, you've got the Constitution. But the point in relation to the Gambling Act, we did actually ask this question of our legal colleagues actually before the meeting, and we need to go back and basically just get some further clarification on that, Councillor Marsh, and then we'll answer your question if we may.
thank you for that. This only really occurred to me in the light, as I say, of the casino, which I suspect other members who didn't make the cut would have liked to have had their say on that issue. But regardless of whether I was or wasn't involved in it, it just seems odd to me that you'd normally expect a subcommittee to make a recommendation to the committee. And here we are, we're all trained, we're all interested in this area. We're representing the public, our electors in this area. And yet, when it comes down to it, we have absolutely no say whatsoever. And I have complete faith in the 3 people who do have a say, but 3 just seems an odd system, really.
I suspect probably the history of this was obviously basically the Licensing Act, the 2003 Act followed on from the old 64 Acts that used to be dealt with by the magistrates. And I suspect probably some history around this is probably the quasi-judicial nature of the
and there would have been
the determination. So back in the day, you would probably have had 3 magistrates sitting down at Newbury Magistrates Court when it was still there. Making a determination, and and obviously the reason you've got an odd number as well is so that you get a majority verdict if that's needed, or a majority decision. But on the specifics of the Gambling Act, we will go away basically and clarify that point for you, both from the constitutional point of view and the legal point of view, and feed that back to you, Councillor Marsh.
Thanks, I appreciate that, and thank you, Chairman, for letting me raise it. I appreciate that.
Not at all, not at all. Paul, you had your hand up to do with that. Would you like to butt in?
It's just to add one other slightly less technical point, but I think it's worth just reminding ourselves, which is that another practical thing that we need to bear in mind is when we set the Constitution and the scheme of delegation up in order to meet the various pieces of legislation and the legal requirements set out for that, there is also the fact that if we set the Constitution up to make it a bigger group, or at least have the option of a bigger group, invariably these processes have to take place in a quite short space of time, and the logistics of getting a larger group in one place during the day for a decision to be made is quite hard. And what we've tended to balance, certainly when I've been involved in discussions about delegations to committees and subcommittees, is that you have to make sure that you're confident that during any given time period, you're going to be able to convene a panel. And whilst this particular group of members may well be fully able to meet such a requirement during the daytime, I think it's fair to say that over the course of us running this for many, many years, it has been on occasion quite challenging to find enough members to do the actual hearings themselves. So what I would just add to the technical points is that there are some practical reasons why they're kept a little bit smaller, just to add that in.
It's also worth perhaps a comment at the same time, Councillor Marsh, that it's been a very odd year. There's been very little for this committee to do in terms of its subcommittees. I'm sure that if you are still involved in this next year, we'll find some work for you.
I'm very grateful. Thank you. I shall look forward to it.
Good. Councillor Linden.
Yes, Chairman, just to reassure Dave Marsh, we did have 3 people have been on for some time on that idea, but also I think a general principle is that the Labour government who set up the Gambling Act did give us advice which we have to follow in terms of their view on gambling. So I think you need to take that into account. Plus, of course, we're very experienced in dealing with that matter. So it's there. But I think also building up the experience of new members is important. And of course, we did have Councillor Rick Jones as the substitute. Obviously, he learned of what was going on and the sort of decisions we need to make.
Thank you, Councillor Linden. Councillor Bridgman.
Yeah, just to follow from what Councillor Linden says, I mean, clearly, my recollection of the Constitution is that we could have the full licensing committee consider an application for whatever it might be. The difficulty there, I think, is that procedurally, you've then got to have officers making a judgment call as to what should go before a full committee and what should go before a subcommittee. And you have very, very importantly, what Paul Anstey's referred to, the difficulty of getting that committee, whether it's a full committee or subcommittee, together, sitting in a relatively short period of time. And so far as the casino application is concerned, absolutely go along with what Tony said, which is that whatever body considers a casino application, it was of course a bingo application, whatever committee considers that is pretty constrained by the Gambling Act. I put it no more highly than that to say that I think your hands are somewhat tied by the regulations about permitting gambling unless there's an awfully good reason not to. And that's all I'll say on that particular subject, Chairman.
Yes, for those of us that were new to the Gambling Act, it was quite an eye-opener. But we were stuck with it. Right. Anybody else like to ask a question? No?
Chair, can I just raise a quick question as a new member? What do we actually do with the report? Does it just go on the website or do we do anything further with it?
This one, we are simply asked to note this one. We're not asked to vote on it.
No, I mean, what do we actually do with it? Like, I know we're asked to note it, but what's the purpose? Is it just to sit on the website? Are we required to do it?
Sean or Paul, which one of you would like to comment?
I think it's really basically to act as a summary, not just of the work of obviously the committee, but basically how the policies set by the committee are translating into the service delivery. So effectively what's before you really is a summary of obviously the policy work of the committee, the decisions of the committee, and basically the work of the service in basically translating those policy decisions into a service. And where does it go? I guess it basically just goes onto into the public record, as is published, and that basically is it. It's a report that we bring every year, really to just kind of summarise what's gone on in any particularly given financial year, basically.
But before I move to Paul, I will comment then that, to my mind, for one thing, it did allow Councillor Marsh to ask his questions. And I thought that the questions were perfectly valid. It was a sane set of questions to ask and answer. It's a useful exercise doing this, bring things to mind. Paul.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So I'd just add to it that there are a couple of, from my perspective, there are a couple of important reasons why some of this content comes to the committee, not necessarily looking for a decision. And certainly I've been involved in a number of conversations with members past and present about whether or not there's merit in bringing forward papers that don't require a decision. I think one of the advantages of having some open discussion on various topics goes back to the earlier point that that we were debating around transparency for the trades, because there's an advantage for us in explaining to them why we think the way we think, why we do what we do, and to have a point in time that we can direct those businesses to say, if you would like to see what the council have been talking about relevant to your particular trade, go to this link on the website and you can see either in the minutes or the reports what the officers have said about it, what the members who you voted in have said about it, and it genuinely does improve the overall discourse between officers and residents and businesses. And for a lot of my work, when you get involved in some of the if you like, the positives and negatives of running a service, it helps in explaining when people raise complaints about the service, and if they want to commend the service, you can say, well, that was directly as a result of a policy decision that was taken, or as a result of a conversation, or maybe it's not happened this evening, but if a member of the public wants to ask a question of the committee, then we can process it in a way that means that they feel like they've been heard in a forum that isn't just an officer sending them an email back. So it does have some really powerful part to play.
And it's not just documentation, because after all, now these meetings are now recorded and out on the web. Anybody else like to add anything else? Councillor Beck. You're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, right. I would support what Paul Anstey has said. Whilst this doesn't fall under the scope of the Governance and Ethics Committee, it does in fact reflect the governance of this council. And as such, you might say that's the only sort of point at which anybody from outside, whether they be in the trade or a taxi user or whatever, can actually sort of find this information. And as you mentioned, it's just given as an example, given David Marshall an opportunity to question, as you might say, what we're doing, etc., etc. And I think we should definitely continue with this practice.
Good, thank you. Well, in that case, if nobody else has anything else to say, we note this report. And let's move on, in that case, to item 6, Statutory Taxi and Private Hire Vehicle Standards Report. Julia, I think.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Yes, this is the statutory taxi and private hire standards, which is something that have been talked about for quite a long time in getting the taxi and private hire vehicle standards, particularly in respect of protecting children and vulnerable individuals, to some consistency as a national level, if you like. So these were introduced, or these were published in July of this year by the Department of Transport. And the guidance, whilst it says it is guidance, is actually, while it says it's statutory, is actually guidance, the wrong way around them. But we are commended to take it on board and to implement it if possible, and if we don't, to explain why we're not going to. Now, in the report document I've given you, I've gone through and highlighted several of the sort of main headlines, if you like, of the new standards. So it talks about things like having a licensing policy for the taxi and private hire industry, which in West Berkshire we don't currently have. We do have terms and conditions, but we don't have a policy as yet. So that is, as members who sat on this committee for a long time will know it's something that we have aspired to do for many years. So that is something that we are now getting together to make sure we have a policy. It also includes things like beefing up the fit and proper test, things like how complaints are made, DBS checks, things, you know, if a driver has been living abroad for more than 3 months, how that can be checked. The things like complaints about drivers, how that would all come about, what we do with them. Mandatory safeguarding awareness for drivers, which I'm pleased to say is something that the committee has already agreed that we do, and drivers do that. So there's quite as you'll see from the report, there's quite a few things there that we will be looking to incorporate into our new policy. The aim of this report is to bring this to your attention, that this is what we're going to be doing, and also to agree that you'd like us to do this work and bring it back to you at a following committee, and hopefully that will be early next year. So thank you. Please, if you have any questions.
Members? Thank you, Julia. Councillor Jones.
Thanks, Chairman. Yeah, this looks as if it's something that could be long overdue, certainly very necessary. My question, though, is, does it have any resource implications for the council?
One of probably quite simple answer is probably, apart from writing the policy, which will be quite resource intensive, and doing the consultation for it, it will be business as usual once there is a policy. So realistically, there shouldn't be a huge amount more additional steps to go through on the applicant process for the industry, if that makes sense. Hopefully that made sense.
But I'm quite new to this as well, like Claire. I presume that we do inspect operators on occasions. Do these standards require more frequent or more careful monitoring?
No, we do do regular enforcement and compliance checks with operators and drivers and vehicles as well. So no, that wouldn't necessarily mean there's going to be any more need to do that. We would just do things perhaps slightly differently. As I say, there is a lot of things in there that we already do, which is great to know.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Rolls.
Thanks, Chair. So thanks for that, Julia. I just wondered if there was any new standards that you were concerned about, particularly.
No, I can't see that there's any that we would be concerned about. No.
I thought it looked a rather useful document.
Absolutely.
Being pulled together in there that made good sense.
Mm-hmm.
No, it was good. It was easy to read as well. Thank you.
Councillor Beck. You have your finger up, but you're muted. You're not muted.
Thank you,
now.
Chairman. I too feel that this is, something which we should definitely do. The only thing that concerns me is that Julia has sort of indicated that once in operation, all this lot will not make a tremendous difference to the, when I say the annual workload, but I do have a concern as to whether or not we are going to need any additional resource assistance to actually bring all this lot together for our consideration and approval.
Oh, there'll be another policy coming to us for reading and approval, without a doubt. Who'd like to comment?
We are currently putting the information together, and we've been given some additional resource in the guise of a solicitor, an external solicitor, who will be bringing all this work together and also looking at the policies across the 3 authorities in an attempt to get something, again, we've aspired to for quite a long period of time, to get the policies fairly well aligned as far as you can, because obviously there are some nuances in each of the authorities. So there will be external person helping us do this work.
Councillor Jones has his thumb up. I think that's a thumb rather than a finger wishing to speak. Good. Right. Anybody else want to make a comment, ask a question? No? In that case, we once again will need a proposer and seconder for this. I'm going to read out the recommendation.
Do you want to formally propose?
I'll second.
I'm happy to propose it, Chairman.
I'm happy to second it, Chairman.
Councillor Beck, Councillor Barnett, and I will read it out. That members note the content of the statutory. Members agree to further reports detailing changes to existing terms and conditions of hackney carriage, private hire and private hire operators licenses, associated requirements of these licenses to be amalgamated into a policy that encompasses the statutory standards. We all vote, please. If you agree with this, raise your hand.
Chairman, I can confirm that that's a unanimous vote in favour of the proposals as set out in the agenda.
Excellent. Thank you. Item 7, forward plan. Do we have any amendments? You've seen the forward plan. Is there any amendment that you would like to make, members, to the forward plan? Councillor Beck, hand up. Councillor Bridgman has his blue hand up, and Councillor Beck appears to have his ordinary hand up. Go on, Councillor Beck.
Right, thank you, Chairman. I would just mention, I guess I'm not alone in this. I noticed the first item to do with the 8th of February meeting is the fireworks motion. I personally am still getting sort of communications by email from, shall we say, concerned residents. So it is clearly something which is of, continuing interest, despite the fact that the fireworks this year have been a lot less than usual. We have obviously got the New Year situation to arise in between our next meeting. I just mentioned that. I don't know, are other people still receiving emails?
There's obviously some interest, and we will be discussing it then. Councillor Bridgman.
Thank you, Chairman. Two things that I think, one thing that I think we might usefully consider where it might sit on the forward plan is what we've just discussed, the policy in relation to the last report on taxes. So I leave officers to consider whether or not there is the available capacity to start work on a policy to bring forward to this committee, and when that might be. The other one is to suggest that I would not have suggested this had it not been for the recent subcommittee meeting that considered the gambling application. But I think that the statement of gambling principles could do with consideration. We overhauled it quite considerably for the one that was published for January 2019, but that was very much a tidying up exercise of the document rather than a real look at what was in the statement. And I think that some of the things that came out of the recent subcommittee hearing might usefully be considered by this committee. And I just wonder whether, if we've got to have a policy in place, and we do, it's a weird bit of legislation. It basically has started, every licensing authority has to have a 3-year license, a 3-year policy on a certain date. It's national. But if we're going to be looking at a policy that needs to come in, a statement of gambling principle needs to come in January 2022, and we're going to be looking at it in November, that will be our last opportunity to look at it. So I wonder whether it should actually come forward earlier than that, so that we have a proper chance to discuss it. So that then the meeting in November would be hopefully the final version to be agreed to go forward, and just a question. I think, Sean, this has got to go to full council for agreement, hasn't it? We are effectively agreeing something to go forward, not agreeing it ourselves.
It would need to go to the December full council, in other words.
Yeah, and I just worry that November's too late if we want to make.
Chair, can I suggest then that we look at the June meeting then for a draft of that? Basically, that gives us then time to go away, look at any further consultation that's needed, and come back to the committee in November with a final version for consideration by the committee for any amendments and everything else before it goes on its journey to full council.
That was certainly my thought process, Chairman.
Yeah. Okay.
Sounds good to me.
The other one that occurred to me with the forward plan as well, basically, is obviously we've got the one that we need to put in on the consultation that we've just talked about, the taxi private hire policy consultation. The second one, obviously, basically, is the potential that we would bring back any outcome from the taxi and private hire fees consultation to the next meeting as well. They would normally come back, if I'm right, Julia, to this committee for consideration of any responses to that statutory consultation process. Would that be? Yeah.
And Chairman, it would be useful to have both of those in the same meeting, so the trade gets an opportunity to come along, if obviously with your agreement, in order to have, so they don't have to come to two meetings, they come to one, and we kill two birds with one stone.
So that would have to be the February meeting then, if we were able to get the fees into full council by the end of February, beginning of March. Yeah, so that's your three items then for February by the looks of it.
Yeah, only thing I'd say, Sean, is that we might need to look at that date of the 8th of February if it's going to make any changes, because the executive was probably, it's usually around Valentine's Day, so that would make it too late. I think we might need to look at the 8th of February as a date then.
Okay.
Okay, well, take a look at that and come back to us if you would. Councillor Barnett, you have your hand.
It was only on the back of that. I was going to ask that as a final point in the meeting, bearing in mind that we've had a deferment of the early part of November meeting until tonight. And obviously we've just heard the answer from Moira that the proposed date in February could well be changed. And that's all I was going to ask. Is it going to be changed? But obviously it could be, or it might be kept in the safe date. Okay.
Right. Anybody, anything else? If not, I think we're done for this evening. So I will say thank you to all of you for attending. It was a good meeting.